Today I'll be presenting some research that we've undertaken recently at the Australian Institute of Criminology, and I've led this research with my colleague Laura Doherty, who some of you may have seen present yesterday in the online misogyny session. This research, as the title shows, empirically explores the connection between the intentional use of pornography and the perpetration of sexual violence, and I'll go into what I mean by that, obviously, as the presentation progresses. Now, I guess this is an early snapshot of the results. They're currently going through a review. It's been a bit of a long burn, this project, so the analysis, there was a lot of back and forth on it, and it did take quite a while, but these results are still in review. So this is an early, I guess, snapshot, and it is very much a snapshot. So I have cherry-picked certain results here that I think will be of most interest to you and that I think go most directly to addressing our research question. So the central research question that we really had for this project was, does the intentional viewing of pornography increase men's likelihood of perpetrating sexual violence? Just a bit of context, which I'm sure many of you are across, but I guess it does warrant some revisiting as a prelude to the results. So Australia's current national plan to end violence against women and children 2022 to 2032 does, as many of you would know, identify pornography use, and especially the early and frequent use of pornography, and especially the use of violent pornography, as a key area of concern in addressing gender-based violence. Now, these are by no means new concerns. Historically, as many of you would be aware, there has been a lot of opposition to pornography or concern regarding pornography coming from certain feminist groups, but also from certain political and religious conservative groups. So really spanning that full ideological spectrum. And these concerns have largely centred on the perceived potential for pornography use, and especially saturation in pornography and certain kinds of pornography to increase mainly men's likelihood of perpetrating sexual violence. So these are not new concerns, but I guess there are certain recent developments that have lit a fire under those concerns, so to speak. The main one being the absolute explosion of pornography on the internet, and its much wider availability now through mainly smartphone technologies, which have given us now devices that we can use to access pretty much all of the world's pornography, or much of the world's pornography, in our pockets pretty much at any time of the day or night. And that includes young people, most of whom have smartphones now. So that development in particular has just seen an explosion in the availability and accessibility of pornography, including to much younger audiences who previously would have had a much tougher time accessing pornography when it was still sold in newsagents, when it was still being shown in those old style pornography theatres that obviously don't exist anymore, but that were around in the 50s, 60s and 70s. With that explosion in availability, there's also been a bit of an explosion in volume. So there is much more pornographic content now on the internet that is available to access. Obviously, you've got large studios, mainly in the US or in North America, pushing out a lot of this content, but you've also got larger and larger numbers of independent content creators, those using OnlyFans and other online platforms to produce and distribute their own pornographic material. So in addition to it being much easier to access, there's also a lot more of it to access. And just finally, riding that wave of increased volume of pornography generally, there's an increased volume of specific forms of pornography that fits into certain previously quite niche genres, but most concerningly, a dramatic increase in the amount of pornographic material depicting violence, various forms of violence. And there are, again, concerns regarding the impact that exposure to this material in particular could have to younger audiences and to people in general who, again, are just increasingly being saturated in this content, have constant, easy, frequent access to it. So not surprisingly, given the long-standing concerns around pornography and its potential impact on our behaviour, including our sexual behaviour, there is a fairly extensive body of research on its impacts, and we'll hear later about that research from my colleagues down here. Broadly speaking, this research, and I won't spend too much time on this, but this research falls into three kind of groups. Population level research, which basically looks at trends in sexual violence and how they correspond to usually changes in legislation that make pornography more widely available within a particular population. And individual level research, which includes experimental research, basically comparing groups of people who are exposed to pornography and those who aren't, and then looking at subsequent usually attitudinal changes in their views towards the use of violence. And observational research, so looking at or asking questions about people's pornography use in the real world and also asking them questions about their perpetration of sexual violence. Population research, population level research, somewhat, I guess, counterintuitively shows that increases in the availability of pornography in a population actually correspond to a slight reduction in rates of sexual violence, although that's not consistent across research. However, there's a lot there you need to disentangle in the broader social, legal, political environments that I don't think those studies do very well, so I would take those findings with a grain of salt. Experimental research, not surprisingly, shows that people who are exposed to pornography do more often or are more likely to report increases in measured rates of general aggression. They're more likely to report aggressive reactions to hypothetical scenarios and so on. Observational research, and this is, I guess, the biggest body of research. There's, I guess, quite a variety in terms of the findings that have emerged, particularly in relation to the use of pornography generally. Some studies show that it is associated with an increased likelihood of perpetrating sexual violence, others don't. But studies that look at pornography depicting violence specifically have shown more consistent findings towards this form of pornography being associated, or its use, its frequent use in particular, being associated with a small increase in the likelihood of perpetrating sexual violence. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this is to highlight the distinction that exists in this research between those studies that focus on pornography as a situational contributor to sexual violence and those that focus on it as a dispositional contributor. So the former body of studies sit primarily in the experimental research space, so they're interested in the shorter term impacts of pornography on sexual violence. So in other words, does looking at pornography, increase the likelihood of somebody going on to commit a sexual offence or engage in sexual violence later that day or in the hours following that? So they're really interested in the shorter term, usually physiological and temporary psychological effects of pornography. Our research doesn't really fit within that body of research. It fits within research that explores the impact of longer term patterns of pornography use on the perpetration of sexual violence, usually through its influence on more stable individual characteristics, so views, attitudes towards sex, and other personality characteristics. So, what are those characteristics? There's been a lot of work to try and understand, I guess, how longer term patterns of pornography use can increase one's likelihood of sexual violence, particularly violent pornography use. One of the most widely known and extensively tested of these theories is what's known as the confluence model. So the confluence model, I guess, has worked harder than many other theories of sexual violence to incorporate pornography into the theoretical explanation that it offers for sexual violence. So a bit of background on the confluence model. It emphasises the importance of two individual constructs, individual characteristics, that it posits underpin a heightened potential for sexual violence. The first relates to a person's sexual attitudes and desires. So it talks about what it calls impersonal sex, but which is also sometimes known as sociosexuality, which is essentially a person's tendency or preference for affectionless, promiscuous sex. So people who I guess rate higher on measures of impersonal sex or sexuality, pardon me, tend not to value emotional connections with the people they have sex with. They tend to view sex more as a kind of an activity to attain physical release. And because of that, they don't really have many feelings towards the people they have sex with. They're quite comfortable having sex with multiple people. Pardon me. And they're quite comfortable with essentially doing the bare minimum to get somebody to have sex with them. So they're not really interested in emotional connections with the people that they're having sex with. The second construct that the confluence model highlights the importance of is essentially attitudes towards women, so hostile sexism. So people having a disparaging or hostile view of women. Now, according to this model, these factors don't so much motivate somebody to engage in sexual violence as they weaken people's cognitive inhibitions against it. So typically, if you care about the person you're having sex with and you have positive attitudes towards women generally, you're less likely to use violence to have sex with them. You're less open to using violence to have sex with them. Conversely, if you're kind of prone towards emotionless, affectionless, promiscuous sex, and your attitudes towards women tend to be more negative, then that leaves you more open to using violence in certain situations in order to pursue sex. I should have highlighted at the start that the confluence model is obviously a theory of male sexual violence, which explains the kind of hostile attitudes towards women and the importance that it places on that. So that's the confluence model. Where does pornography fit in? So according to this model, pornography basically acts as an exacerbator of these two constructs, of this inherent, I guess, disposition or this inherent disposition towards sexual violence. So it argues first that people who are higher in these constructs, who rate higher in these constructs, are more likely to use pornography, but they're also more likely to be affected by it. And essentially what you get is this cycle of people being higher in these two characteristics, being more likely to use pornography. Pornography in turn exacerbates these characteristics and heightens them, and on it goes, further exacerbating their potential for sexual violence. Now, at the heart of its claims regarding the role of pornography in sexual violence are, I guess, two statistical relationships, a moderated relationship and a mediated relationship. So it essentially argues, first of all, that people who are high in these traits and who watch pornography are more likely to engage in sexual violence than those who are high in these traits and don't watch pornography. But it also argues that the relationship between pornography and sexual violence is accounted for by these two traits. So in other words, those two traits mediate the relationship between pornography use and sexual violence. Now, as I said, there's a fairly significant body of research examining this model, and a lot of it has empirically examined the first claim, but almost none of that research has examined the second claim. So in other words, we don't actually know whether and to what extent these two traits, these two characteristics, account for the relationship or the association between pornography use and sexual violence, which is important because a lot of what we're trying to do to address the potential impact of pornography use on sexual violence really tries to get in the middle of that relationship and counteract its influence. So obviously in Australia at the moment there's a lot of talk about age verification technologies and other means of basically blocking access to pornography, especially among young people. That, I guess, is less dependent on an understanding of why this association exists. But other measures like improved education in schools, improved awareness around consent, they do rely on an understanding of why this association occurs and what variables sit in between intentional pornography use and sexual violence. So I think that's why it's important to try to tease that relationship out a little bit and look at what's happening in between the two, which is ultimately what we tried to do. So we undertook a survey in mid to late 2023 of Australian residents aged 18 to 45 years, men and women. So the total sample was 5,076 respondents. Our analysis was limited to a subset of this sample, specifically to heterosexual cisgender men who had viewed pornography intentionally or not at least once in their lives. So this led to the exclusion of a very small number of men, about 30 men in our sample, who indicated that they had never once intentionally or unintentionally viewed pornography. There were reasons for that I'm happy to go into, but the simple answer is that we intend to do further research with this sample, and it made sense methodologically to exclude those 30 or so individuals. And the survey asked a wide range of questions about people's intentional viewing of pornography, their perpetration of sexual violence, their victimisation by sexual violence, along with a number of other psychological measures. So Our key variables and how we measured them. So our key independent variable here is the intentional viewing of pornography up until 12 months prior to completing the survey. So when we asked questions about intentional pornography use, we asked about their use up until 12 months prior to completing the survey and in the 12 months completing the survey. So we're basically getting at historical porn use and kind of more current porn use. Now, obviously, you could do this a lot more effectively in the context of a longitudinal study, administering the same survey multiple times to the same respondents, but I guess this is the next best thing, and acknowledging the limitations in that approach, because you're asking people to retrospectively estimate how much pornography they used in that period of time. So obviously you've got limitations to deal with there regarding lapses in memory and so on, but it does allow us to kind of sequence things a little bit, and that'll become a bit more apparent as I go on. So we asked questions about the use of any pornography, so this could include violent or non-violent pornography, and specifically about violent pornography. I'll explain what violent pornography means in a second. And we look at the association of ever having intentionally viewed these forms of pornography and the frequency with which we viewed them. Frequency was measured on a 7-point scale ranging from never through to several times a day. Our key dependent variable was sexual violence perpetrated in the 12 months prior to completing the survey. Sexual violence included that range of activities there, so ranging from pressuring someone for dates or sexual activity all the way through to non-consensual sexual intercourse, kissing, sexual contact, and stealthing or non-consensual sex without a contraception or removing contraception during sex without the consent of the other person. And I apologise, I did have a slide in here explaining what violent pornography was. I just realised I didn't include it, but broadly violent pornography was pornography that depicted a wide range of acts perpetrated by one person in that material against another or another person's. This could range from obviously acts of physical violence, a wide range of acts of physical violence, but also certain people in the scene or in the material looking like they didn't want to be there, being verbally humiliated or degraded or abused, being forcefully kept there or forcefully subjected to sexual acts in various other ways. So there was a very wide range of behaviours that we used to define violent pornography and distinguish it from other forms of pornography. Our mediator variables, so the first, sociosexuality, which basically gets at the impersonal sex construct specified in the confluence model. This was measured using a multi-item scale with Likert responses, and it's defined as an orientation towards promiscuous, uncommitted and impersonal sexual activities. And the second was hostile sexism, which we measured using the hostile sexism subscale of the ambivalent sexism scale, which we defined as an antipathy to or disparaging view of women. I should point out that the hostile sexism scale measures negative attitudes towards women generally. It doesn't measure a sexual preference for violence against women specifically. So we're not picking up on that with this scale. We're picking up on more generalised negative attitudes towards them. So I've split the presentation of the results into two parts. The first looks at the overall association of intentional pornography use and sexual violence perpetration. The next looks a little deeper into the mediated relationship that I was talking about, graphically represented there. I should mention we also controlled for a number of covariates in the models that we ran to explore this association. I won't go over them now, but broadly speaking, they include some certain demographic characteristics like age and place of residence, relationship history, history of exposure to sexual violence through friends and family, and so on. But I'm happy to give a more comprehensive outline to anyone who'd like to know after the presentation. So this doesn't really get at the research question, but I just thought I'd include it because people tend to find it interesting. So in our sample, 87% of respondents had intentionally viewed any pornography up until 12 months ago, and 45% of respondents had intentionally viewed violent pornography up until 12 months ago. In terms of frequency, I've plotted that there. So the dark line represents frequency of intentional viewing of any pornography, and the light blue line represents violent pornography. Overall, the any pornography line tends to be a little bit straighter, but it dips right off once you move past several times a week, whereas the intentional viewing of violent pornography follows a more, I guess, stable downward trend. So again, a little over half the sample had never intentionally viewed it or hadn't intentionally viewed it up until 12 months preceding the survey, and then gradually lower proportions of them had until you had about less than 10% viewing it several times a week or more, which is still quite concerning. So these are just the raw differences in the proportion of people who perpetrated sexual violence by each level of frequency of intentional pornography viewing. Again, the dark green line there is any pornography and the light blue line is violent pornography. The dotted line there is the overall kind of proportion of the sample who perpetrated sexual violence in the 12 months preceding completion of the survey. So it was a little over 10% of our sample who had perpetrated sexual violence. Again, as you can see there, the any pornography line kind of tracks that dotted line relatively closely, but there's a far more distinct increase in the probability of having perpetrated sexual violence as frequency of intentional pornography viewing increases. And then among the respondents who indicated viewing it several times a day, around half of them indicated that they had perpetrated sexual violence. Thankfully, that's very low in number, but still a very high proportion. These are raw differences, so they're not adjusted for our covariates. So these are the marginal effects. So these are basically the probabilities of having perpetrated sexual violence by each level of frequency of intentional pornography viewing, adjusted for covariates, which is why I presented them as probabilities and not percentages. But you can think of them as percentages if that makes sense. So looking first at any pornography, again, the line there is quite straight, which essentially suggests that the intention of, or the frequency with which any pornography is intentionally viewed has a fairly insignificant effect on one's likelihood of perpetrating sexual violence. Some interesting things there that we could go into, and there's some interesting variables that I think we could look at. Our survey, for example, includes a scale measuring essentially dependence on pornography, so how dependent one feels on the use of pornography for stress relief and whatnot. And we've also got items looking at the kind of number of sexual partners, so I think it'd be interesting to kind of look at those and tease that relationship out a bit. But just looking at these results here, they suggest that the frequency with which any pornography is intentionally viewed isn't that strongly associated with one's probability of perpetrating sexual violence. But when we look at violent pornography, we do see, again, a more clear upward trend there. Not as dramatic as the raw results, but still showing that the probability of sexual violence increases as the frequency with which violent pornography is viewed increases. Now, we can summarise this using what's called the instantaneous rate of change, which is basically the average difference in these probabilities as you move up the frequency scale. So looking at any pornography first, the instantaneous rate of change is basically 0.002, negative 0.002. Essentially what that means is that as you move up each point on that frequency scale, the probability of perpetrating sexual violence decreases by 0.002, and that's not statistically significant. But in relation to violent pornography, the instantaneous rate of change is 0.012. So essentially, as you move up the frequency there, the probability of perpetrating sexual violence increases by 0.12, and that is statistically significant. And if you want to think of those as percentages, there's a 0.2 percentage point decrease in relation to any pornography and a 1.2 percentage point increase in relation to violent pornography. That does seem small, but when you look at it as a relative change, going from never to once a week, for example, there's a close to 50% increase in probability of perpetrating sexual violence there. And then if you go up to several times a day, your likelihood's almost doubled. So it's not insubstantial. I'll skip over these next few slides just in the interest of time. These basically show the association of sociosexuality and hostile sexism with the frequency of violent pornography use and one's likelihood of perpetrating sexual violence. This next stage of the analysis focuses on the mediated relationship specifically. This next stage of the analysis, which focuses on the mediated relationship, hones in on violent pornography given the significant results in the first stage of the analysis. So we don't look at any pornography as part of this stage of the analysis. But essentially what we're doing here is we're decomposing the total effect that we identified in the first stage of the analysis into indirect and direct effects. So the indirect effect is our mediated relationship. So we want to know how much of that total effect that we identified in the first stage of the analysis is accounted for by our two mediated variables, sociosexuality and hostile sexism. So in other words, how much do these two constructs explain of that association between the intentional viewing of violent pornography and the perpetration of sexual violence? So that's our indirect relationship. And then what we call our direct relationship is basically the portion of that total effect that's left over after we've accounted for the indirect effect, while adjusting for covariates. So remembering back to a few slides ago where I showed that instantaneous rate of change of 0.012 in relation to the intentional viewing of violent pornography, that's our total effect. I've summarised the indirect effect here, so the portion of that effect that occurs through sociosexuality and hostile sexism, that's 0.005. So about half of that total effect is due to pornography's positive impact on sociosexuality and hostile sexism. So to summarise that, as I've just said, almost half of violent pornography's association with sexual violence perpetration is accounted for by respondents' orientation towards promiscuous impersonal sex and their hostile attitudes towards women. So basically, frequent intentional viewing of violent pornography is exacerbating these two constructs and in turn increasing the likelihood of one perpetrating sexual violence. So just to wrap up, I've given that summary. Now, as I said at the start, there are certain possible mediators that we don't look at as part of this research, and obviously that indirect effect doesn't completely account for the total effect, so there are probably other things at play there, deviant sexual preferences, and some of those situational contributors that I spoke about. And as I alluded to at the start, really getting into this relationship and understanding what's happening in between it obviously has important implications for a number of the measures that we're currently exploring for obviously controlling access to pornography, but also counteracting its influence. So knowing that these two constructs play a significant role in pornography's association with sexual violence really lets us hone in on them and tailor some of our response strategies to them. But I'll leave it at that. Thanks.